the larger the clients, the more you're going to have to kind of put at risk into the future.
Hmm.
So 30 to 50% upfront, the remaining 50 to 70% usually spread across 2 or 3 years, usually in relatively equal chunks. And then that earnout is contingent on hitting mutually agreed upon performance targets. It could be
Hmm.
top line revenue, it could be maintaining a certain percentage of EBITDA, net income, it could be retaining key clients. And obviously, from a seller's perspective, you're going to want to make those as achievable as possible.
Welcome back to SEOleverage.com. This is episode 131. My name is Gerd Mellak. I'm your host. And today I'm really excited to have a special guest on the podcast. Very often I get information from our clients that they are tossing around this thought in their head if they could actually sell their brand, their course, their agency, and so on. So I brought a special guest, Jonathan Baker, to the show. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thanks. Thanks for having me.
It's awesome. Thanks for being here. You're an M&A specialist, mergers and acquisition specialist over at punctuation.com. What I found interesting about you is your specialization on marketing firms or firm acquisitions. Is that correct?
Yeah, and not just marketing firms, but really small to mid-sized deals. So
Mhm.
folks with revenues usually between 2 and 20 million.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, I definitely know a lot of the big agencies. This is their preferred method to grow, just by small agencies like ours, to get up to the top. And I'm sure a lot of those concepts we are going to talk about in the next half hour or so, we are definitely going to be applicable to a lot of other businesses as well. Really, first, a question: how did you come to acquisitions? Can you briefly tell us how this went for you?
Yeah, sure. So I actually own another business, a craft brewery
Mhm.
based in the Southeast in America. And we went through the M&A process as a seller, got left at the altar ultimately, but it was a eye-opening experience. And I think I just fell in love with the, the thrill of mergers and acquisitions. It was a much more emotional process than I was
Yeah.
expecting. Um, and I think a lot more qualitative in nature than I was expecting. So I joined Punctuation 4 years ago to help build out the M&A side of the practice. And we do, 30 to 40 valuations a year, between 10 and 20 transactions, all with small to mid-sized independent firms.
Mhm. So how does this work actually? It's actually a really good point, and I want to make sure we bring this across. How does this work when you evaluate a firm, or from an owner's perspective? How do I know how much I can ask for my business?
There's a lot of factors, and that's why it can be helpful to get the opinion of, someone who is active in the space. But generally, you're going to want to look at things like the size of your profits. The closer you can get to, a million plus, that opens up a lot more potential buyers. Um, your client roster, who, what's the makeup of your clients, and do you have one kind of big gorilla that would pose a flight risk,
Yeah.
um, that would decrease the value of the firm? Your positioning. So if you're tightly positioned, that's going to help you get more value out of your firm. If you have any kind of recurring revenue options, if you um, have repeatable business development processes, you want to be a firm that's less reliant on the founder or owner or whoever's going to be transitioning out of the firm, right? So to the extent you can put process in place to help replace the owner, that's certainly going to help drive up your valuation. And then you've got some things like, if you have proprietary IP, tools you've developed, the seniority of your staff. Oftentimes you've got firms acquiring simply because they want your employees.
Mhm. So it's definitely a varying demand, I guess, based on where we are in the economy, where we are, or what the strategy of a potential buyer might actually be to either get rid of you in the space, or yeah, really acquire the processes, acquire the frameworks, the software, or whatever. I've heard also that the software firms sell for higher multiples than service businesses. Is this correct?
Generally, that's true. Professional services businesses, are so reliant on the people, and that's just not as scalable as software. So yeah, generally, the closer you can get your business to a software or SaaS type model, the higher the multiple you'll be able to command.
That's interesting. That's interesting. Yeah. Somebody wants to sell their business at some point, right? When would they have to start putting things in the right directions, or preparing this? It's probably not something you can do within 2 months, probably also not six. What is a normal timeline from the decision that, hey, I'm going to sell this firm, to actually having it at the point where a sale is actually possible?
Yeah, well, the first thing you're going to want to do is kind of back into a timeline. And in professional services, at least, most of these deals require the seller to stay on board for 2 to 3 years. And so
Mhm.
you need to make sure that you're going to have enough gas in the tank, you know, 3 years from when you sell. So you're trying to kind of predict the future a little bit. Um, and then beyond that, it really comes down to the individual and their life goals. Are you nearing retirement age? Are you looking at a career change? Are you, if it's purely for financial reasons, then you're just going to want to pay attention to the books, pay attention to the market, and time things the best you can. Usually, you're going to want to have at least one really solid year of financials behind you. Ideally, three, and they could be growing um, towards your most recent year. That's going to put you in the best position, but you can certainly sell even if you've had a down year. Sometimes, there are ways to kind of explain away some of the ups and downs of the business. So, if you're thinking about selling at some point, I mean, I think it really makes sense to get something like a valuation done as
Yeah.
soon as possible, just so you have a starting point to know, okay, what do I need to get to? Where do I need to focus my efforts in order to get this business to where I want it to be to sell? And then ask yourself, am I going to have the time and energy to get there?
Interesting. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. The 3 years probably. Is this how do people react when you tell them about? I think this is called an earnout. Is it right?
Yes, an earnout. Yes.
What how do does everybody who approaches you because they want to sell their firm know that they probably have to stay a few years more?
Many do know, but some don't. And the ones that don't, it can be a little bit of a rude awakening. And I feel like I'm like the bearer of bad news. It's like, I'm sorry, this is just, if you think about it from their perspective, they're paying a lot of money for you, and they want to make sure that your firm's not going to collapse in on itself. And so they kind of need you around for a few years in order to, help with the transition. So it makes sense to them once you explain it, but it's certainly not, it's a little bit of a downer.
I imagine. I imagine. I think everybody has this fantasy in their mind. It's like when you say, okay, I really don't want to do this anymore. I get a larger sum of money and then do something else. You still need to be around, but it obviously makes sense, especially with service businesses. I've always had service businesses. You're just so involved. You're the face of the company, especially in the small and medium-sized business area. You're the face. You're probably behind a lot of strategies. You're probably behind R&D. and just to transfer all this knowledge and the responsibilities and build this train and build a sales team or whatever might be in place by the on the seller buyer side already. It just takes a long time, and obviously the team needs to come over as well. What does such a deal look like in general terms? Where it's like, okay, there's probably some money exchange, I guess, before the 3 years are over. Is this then like a salary for the owner they receive over the 3 years? Or can you talk a little bit about those deals, how they are structured?
Yeah, sure. Every deal's a little different, but I would say kind of on average, you might expect 30 to 50% upfront in cash. The biggest variable there is going to be your client roster, and if you have, large clients, the larger the clients, the more you're going to have to kind of put at risk into the future.
Mm-hmm.
So 30 to 50% upfront, the remaining 50 to 70% usually spread across 2 or 3 years, usually in relatively equal chunks. And then that earnout is contingent on hitting mutually agreed upon performance targets. It could
Mm-hmm.
be top line revenue, it could be maintaining a certain percentage of EBITDA, net income, it could be retaining key clients. And obviously, from a seller's perspective, you're going to want to make those as achievable as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Makes obviously a lot of sense. Yeah. This is really an interesting space. Yeah. I've heard about so many. I think who was even Gary Vee was talking about his long-term strategy, I think, of buying hundreds and even thousands of agencies at some point to make sure VaynerMedia is at some point the largest agency. I think this was years ago when I heard this for the first time. I said, yeah, it's obviously an interesting growth strategy, but I know a lot of agency coaches as well talk about preparing the agency, getting it ready. One thing I heard at some point was a good, what was this? I forgot the author of this book. Like a good business to sell is a good business to keep or something like this.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that the framing was like if it's ready to sell, so you as the owner, you're not as involved, you have a team in place, it's actually working on its own. It's not so much a necessity to sell anymore. Do you have ever work with somebody who gets close to this stage and then says, hey, this is actually now really prepared and working well, I don't have to sell?
Yes, absolutely. And actually, we'll have firms come to us and say, "Hey, I want to get my business ready to sell." We'll take a look at it, we'll do a valuation, and we'll say, "I don't think you should sell. You're gonna make, if you consider an earnout, you're gonna make the same or more just by keeping it and running it because you're incredibly profitable. You're paying yourself a good salary. You've got a solid number two in place." So, the goal should be to build a business like that where you have optionality. You can sell it or you could keep it and run it with minimal effort.
Yeah, I wonder if a good test run is to take like a longer vacation and just see what happens. Where it's like, okay, I'm just going to be off for the next month, and I come back and see what is left of the business. Are there any strategies that you recommend your clients to test drive where the issues are they have to fix?
I mean, you nailed it. You start with a long vacation, and then the next step is a sabbatical where you're, taking 3 months off with no contact. And it's a great way to pressure test the business and the processes to see if what you have put in place will be sufficient if someone else were to come and try to take over. Um, I mean, those are really the only two ways that I know to kind of really test the company.
You learn a lot with these experiments. I usually whenever I come back from a vacation, I usually don't take like longer than a week or two, honestly, because I'm always very close to the projects we work on. But you learn a lot. It's always like we have a meeting, say, okay, what went good, what is broken, broken usually means that somebody is missing permission, somebody doesn't have an employee credit card to make an urgent payment somewhere, somebody doesn't have
Yeah.
access to the to certain tools or credentials or something like this. I think we have dialed in over the years. We have dialed in really good processes here, but it's always you always learn something when you go away, and always prepare the team and say, look, I'm going to be a couple of weeks on vacation. Um, my team has really clear guidelines. Okay, if in doubt, in favor of the client and things like those, we have those rules in place. But we even whenever I come back from vacation, we then always have a list and say, okay, my operations manager needs a credit card. My operations manager needs to have access to those things. We need the support team to have access to the client credentials, etc. So you always learn a lot.
Yeah, one thing that I recommend folks do before they take a long vacation or sabbatical is for, 3 months before that, uh, just be really diligent about any email that crosses your computer, any Slack messages you get. Make sure that it's something that someone else is trained to handle.
Mm-hmm.
And usually, if you can do that for 3 months, and now you have folks who are trained to handle every single one of those things that has popped up, you have caught most of the items. Now there's going to be some stuff that comes up annually, like taxes and things like that, that you might miss. But generally, that's a good strategy.
What I like to do is have a few days here and there where I'm somewhere in a cafeteria with an iPad, and then I just know what those tasks are, where I would just open up my browser and jump in and fix this real quickly. Because I really don't work. I don't work well on an iPad. I can use Slack and email on an iPad, but I don't like to analyze websites, do SEO work on an iPad, or create strategy
Yeah.
documents and stuff like that. So I might just sit for a day in a cafeteria and use my iPad Pro there and just make note of all the things I would love to do at the computer right now. And all those things are definitely where we need to train somebody to be able to handle those.
Yep.
That's awesome. What are those? If I let's continue this example. So I have this deal. I'm okay with the earnout. How much time does it, or how hard it is to find a buyer?
So I think of finding a buyer as a kind of cyclical process. And the way I describe it to some people is swings at the plate. So you've got, annually, basically, this cycle continues over and
Mhm.
over. And if you think about the pool of buyers, particularly for smaller firms, it's usually larger firms. It's not private equity or, venture capital.
Yeah.
And so they might be tied up in other deals. They might have low cash reserves. You might have just timed the market wrong. So it can take 2 to 3 cycles to find a buyer. But once you get into an individual cycle, it's usually, 2 months of preparation where you are getting your valuation updated, you are getting marketing materials created, and then there's, your go-to-market. So the whole process can take 9 to 12 months. It could be as early as 6 months, but that's pretty rare to have something move that quickly. But that 9 to 12 months is not always active. And so you're going to be sitting there twiddling your thumbs while you're waiting for a buyer to respond to some documents you provided. It happens in starts and stops.
Right. How do clients react when they hear that their service firm, their marketing firm is being acquired? Are you in any way involved in that process as well, or advising on how to make the transition for the client base as well?
Yeah, usually that's something you want to strategize prior to an announcement because
Mhm.
you, knowing the clients, are going to know which ones might be more sensitive to a change in control versus others. Likely the bulk of your clients won't care that much, particularly if you're going to remain on board for the time being.
Mhm.
Um, but if there are certain clients that you're a little bit worried about, those you're going to want to develop kind of an individualized strategy for. In general, though, we don't see big exodus of clients. We don't see big exodus of employees. I think those are, horror stories that you hear about, but uh, in most deals, it's just not the reality.
Mhm. What's the dynamic after the sale happens? So the owner still stays around. What's the dynamic then? I understand this. The owner is pretty much then an employee of this new construct, still responsible, still doing the same thing, or training somebody else, or what's their responsibility after the transition?
It depends a lot on why the acquisition was made, but in many cases, the owner's responsibility will switch more into business development and sales. And in part, that's selfish to be able to hit any earnout targets that they have ahead of them.
Mm-hmm.
But also in part, and one of the reasons some owners are looking to sell is that they're able to offload some of the day-to-day administrative, HR, payroll, uh, that type of work to the larger teams, kind of in-house
Mm-hmm.
department. And then you've got some owners who really thrive being an employee again, which is, maybe in the minority, but it does happen. And we've seen instances where those employees now stay on past their earnouts and are now, heading up M&A at the firm that acquired them, for example.
I have a friend who sold his company and actually then became the new CEO of the new firm because he was doing really well during the earnout, and they actually wanted him for CEO, so he got a completely new deal. Not sure if he ended up getting like even shares of the new company then or something, but it was something weird because I actually expected him to take a year off or two, and then he said, "No, I'm going to be the new CEO."
Yeah, I mean, most folks who are entrepreneurs starting firms don't, it's not like they don't want to work. A lot of us like working.
Yeah.
And so you kind of go in expecting that you're going to be sitting on the beach with a pina colada, but then you get bored and antsy and you want to jump right back in.
That makes sense. Yeah, really, it's hard if you're so involved with a business to actually first of all even think about giving away your baby to somebody else.
Yep.
But also the routine you have with being used to probably working 7 days a week in what shape or form. I hardly know any business owner who completely disconnects on a weekend. But then also, yeah, just finding like a new routine. What is my routine going to be, right? How am I going to structure my life? What does my day today look like?
Yeah. And I will say, the analogy of giving away your baby, the most successful sales, that process has been partially completed already because you have grown the company to a place where you can no longer have your hands on every single aspect. And so you have to give up control in order to scale the business, even without an external buyer. And yes, this is still your baby, and there is still a lot of feeling and emotion tied up in often businesses connected with your own identity, and that's something you have to kind of pull apart. It can be something that you almost need, therapy for, which is part of my role.
Right.
But yes, it can be difficult.
I imagine. I want to very briefly talk about the other side as well. So if I imagine obviously M&A also is about acquisition. Do you help agencies acquire other agencies as well?
We do, yes.
When is this something people start looking into? Is this a certain size they reach, a certain challenge they have? When does this become the topic to acquire the first firm?
Yeah, we find it most with more ambitious um, owners of firms, and the smaller the firm, the lower the multiple generally. So the larger the firm, the higher the multiple you're able to get. and that multiple, that high multiple is on a higher number. And so you end up with this kind of, exponential growth curve,
Mm.
which can make it attractive, very attractive to try to basically level up your agency to that next multiple band effectively. And so when we see someone kind of, hitting the top of they think they could command a 6x multiple. Um, but if they were larger, they could command a 10x. That's when they start thinking about acquiring other firms, particularly profitable firms, and then kind of bundling them all together in order to increase the overall value and thus the overall future exit.
Right. I was going to ask you before about the range of multiples for marketing agents. Is there a range that we could name here that's reasonable to expect?
Yeah, for for small to mid-sized, it's usually between 2.5 to 6x. And I realize that's not a super tight range, but a lot depends on how tightly you're positioned and what verticals you specialize in, and if you're profitable. So uh, we like to sell firms for, I think, a minimum of 4x. So that's our goal, is to get firms to a place where they can command that multiple.
One thing I think that would be interesting really for somebody listening to this who might run their own agency, maybe building an agency or looking to sell, would you have like 2 or 3 tips they could take away to actually prepare for that or get their agency's valuation up?
One would be to get a valuation done so that you have
Mhm.
a starting point. Second would be to make sure that you are running an operationally clean business and that your books are clean. So your P&L isn't messy. You're not intermingling personal expenses, running those through the business, which can be hard to pull out because you're going to want to demonstrate, as much profit as possible, which I recognize can sometimes be at odds with tax strategy planning. But you kind of some have to make a determination if you're trying to sell the business. You really do want profits to be as high as possible.
Mhm.
And then the third tip would be to just try to make the firm less dependent on you in any ways that you can, and that'll help set you up for future success.
Is acquiring smaller firms a quick option to get your own valuation up?
On paper, yes, but integrating smaller firms can be very difficult. Smaller firms tend to take on the culture or personality of the founders, the owners. And so if they're not going to be around for long, you're left with, how do I get all of these people working together, duplicative processes, clients all over the map. So you really do have to think about the integration process as well. And that is where a lot of the heavy lifting happens in an acquisition type strategy.
Really interesting. Really interesting. I think there's so much we could probably go down to the different levels here and talk about it. I do appreciate very much how you openly talk about this. I think it's a topic we don't hear too much about. I've asked around before this interview a little bit among my non-business friends, and M&A for many of them isn't even a topic they would know what exactly this stands for. So we're in business, obviously, we have heard about it, but it's interesting how many parallel universes there are. Um, M&A definitely is something I know my clients and many listeners of this podcast are going to be really, really interested in. If they want to know more about this, get in touch with you, maybe get their own valuation done, what would be the best way to get in touch?
Yeah, we actually set up a website for your listeners, punctuation.com/SEO leverage. So just go to that website. You'll be able to email me, sign up for our newsletter, look at our valuation offerings, and I'm happy to answer any questions that come up.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely recommend the newsletter. There's quite some good information in there. And I think it's for me, it's always about keeping those topics that I know I'm going to be interested in a few months or maybe years, keeping those topics close and just making sure I pick up a few things here and there, same as I might on Instagram follow a hashtag just to get inspired a little bit. I like to have those inspirational points in my inbox as well. So definitely can recommend everybody signs up for your newsletter there. Jonathan, thank you so much for taking the time. It's really great to talk to an expert like you and get like first-hand information. You're doing this on a regular basis. You're involved in many mergers, many acquisitions every year. We might have to have you back in the future, talk a little bit more about this topic and some more details. Let's get some feedback from our listeners, some questions they have, and we might reach out to have you back soon.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. If you want to have a recap of this episode, head over to seoleverage.com/podcast. This is episode 131. We are providing a written recap of these conversations with the main points, the main questions, and are also going to link to punctuation.com/SEO leverage, where you can sign up for the newsletter and get in touch with Jonathan directly. Thank you so much and stay tuned. Thanks, Jonathan.